Chapter 1. The Bed of Desperation. Gi-hun was not a bad man. He would have argued that himself, loudly, to anyone who dared imply otherwise. He wasn't bad, he was just unlucky. Yet luck was a cruel mistress, one that had abandoned him long before he even realized she existed. It was not her absence that kept him up at night, though. It was her bitter memory. Once upon a time, Gi-hun had tasted success. A good job, a family, a daughter he adored. All those things had been his. Now they were distant dreams, as unreachable as the stars he glimpsed from the dingy corner of his one-room apartment. The day began like every other, mundane, suffocating, and predictable. Gi-hun shuffled out of bed, groaning as he checked his phone. No messages. Of course not. Even his creditors had stopped hounding him, not out of charity, but because they knew there was nothing left to squeeze from him. He had debt stacked so high he'd long since lost track of the number, let alone the total amount. That was someone else's problem now. Some faceless lender who wouldn't hesitate to break his kneecaps if the mood struck. Still, he had no time to dwell. Today was his daughter's birthday, and Gi-hun had plans. His daughter, Gi-yong, was his world, even if she spent most of her time in another. After the divorce, custody had gone to her mother, a woman who had no patience left for Gi-hun's failures. Despite their distance, Gi-hun was determined to make Gi-yong's birthday special, though his pockets were emptier than his fridge. He spent the morning pacing the streets, borrowing here and stealing there. A few thousand won from his mother's purse, a clever sleight of hand to snatch a stranger's forgotten wallet. The guilt gnawed at him, but he buried it deep. This wasn't about him, it was about Gi-yong. With enough money scraped together, he headed to the horse track, the only place he believed luck might still reside. The track was chaos incarnate, a whirlwind of shouting, laughter, and desperation. Men and women alike clutched their tickets as though they were lifelines, their faces masks of hope and fear. Gi-hun fit right in. He placed his bet with trembling hands, pouring everything he had into a single, reckless gamble. The race began, and Gi-hun's heart pounded in time with the thunder of hooves. His horse, number 6, pulled ahead, inching closer to victory with every stride. Gi-hun clenched his fists, his body taut with tension. And then miraculously it happened. Number 6 crossed the finish line first. Gi-hun erupted into laughter, a wild, disbelieving sound that turned heads. He was rich, well, richer than he'd been that morning. For the first time in years, he felt the intoxicating rush of triumph. He didn't waste a second, sprinting to collect his winnings. The wad of cash in his hands felt unreal, a dream made tangible. He didn't keep it for long. As he left the track, flushed with victory, 2 men approached him. They weren't friends, though they acted like it, their smiles sharp and predatory. Loan sharks. Gi-hun's euphoria evaporated as they cornered him, demanding repayment. No amount of pleading or excuses would sway them. Before he could protest further, they grabbed him, dragging him into a shadowy alley. What followed was humiliation. Gi-hun handed over the bulk of his winnings, his hands trembling with fury and despair. To add insult to injury, the sharks forced him to sign away what little he had left, his body, his dignity, his future. If he didn't pay the rest soon, they would take it out on him in ways he didn't dare imagine. When they left, Gi-hun slumped against the wall, tears burning his eyes. He clutched the few remaining bills, a pitiful fraction of his earlier fortune. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But he refused to return empty-handed. He bought a modest gift for Gi-yong, a cheap claw machine toy, and a meal to share with her. By the time he reached his ex-wife's house, night had fallen. Gi-yong greeted him with a smile that melted his heart. For a moment, he forgot his failures. He gave her the gift, watching as her eyes lit up with delight. The meal, though humble, was shared with laughter and warmth. But the illusion of happiness was fragile. Gi-hun's ex-wife soon reminded him of his shortcomings, her words sharp and unforgiving. Gi-yong, despite her love for him, couldn't hide her disappointment. She wanted her father to be a hero, but all she saw was a man who couldn't stay afloat. As he left, the weight of his inadequacy pressed down on him. The world outside was cold and unkind, its streets a maze of despair. Gi-hun wandered aimlessly, his thoughts a storm of regret and self-loathing. It was then, in the depths of his misery, that he met the man who would change his life. The man was unremarkable at first glance, dressed in a sharp suit that exuded professionalism. He approached Gi-hun with a friendly smile, holding a briefcase that seemed out of place in the grimy subway station. "Would you like to play a game?" the man asked, his voice smooth and inviting. Gi-hun blinked, taken aback. What kind of game? The man explained, producing a set of colorful tiles. It was a simple game. Flip the tile to match the color. If Gi-hun won, he would earn 100,000 won for each victory. If he lost, he would owe the same. There was one catch. Since Gi-hun had no money, the man offered a different form of payment. Each loss would earn Gi-hun a slap across the face. It sounded absurd, but Gi-hun's desperation made him reckless. He agreed, and the game began. The first round ended in humiliation. The man's tile flipped perfectly, while Gi-hun's failed. True to his word, the man slapped Gi-hun with shocking force. The sting was sharp, but Gi-hun refused to back down. He played again and again, enduring loss after loss. Each slap echoed in the empty station, leaving Gi-hun's face red and swollen. Finally, luck shifted. Gi-hun won a round, and the man handed him a crisp 100,000 won bill. The taste of victory was sweeter than the pain of the slaps. Gi-hun played on, earning enough to soothe his battered pride and fill his pockets. When the game ended, the man offered something even more tantalizing, a card, simple yet elegant, with a phone number printed in bold. If you want to earn more, the man said, call this number. We're looking for players like you. Gi-hun hesitated, the card burning in his hand. He wanted to dismiss it as a scam, but the man's gaze was steady, almost hypnotic. Desperation clouded Gi-hun's judgment. He pocketed the card, telling himself it was just a backup plan. The man left without another word, disappearing into the crowd. Gi-hun stood there, his thoughts racing. The promise of wealth was intoxicating, but the implications were troubling. Who were these people? What kind of games did they play? That night, as Gi-hun lay in his cramped apartment, the card seemed to glow with temptation. His mind replayed the man's words, the promise of something better. He thought of Ji-yong, of his mother, of the debts that shadowed his every step. The decision was inevitable. With trembling hands, he dialed the number. A voice answered, cold and mechanical, instructing him to meet at a specific location. The next day, Gi-hun arrived, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. A sleek black van awaited him, its windows tinted to conceal its occupants. Gi-hun hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. As the van doors closed, darkness enveloped him. He caught a glimpse of other passengers, their faces obscured by shadows. The air was thick with tension, a shared unease that bound them together. The last thing Gi-hun saw was a needle, its point glinting in the dim light. Pain lanced through his neck, and the world blurred. When he woke, he was no longer in the van. He was lying on a firm mattress, surrounded by rows of identical beds. The room was vast and sterile, its walls painted in muted tones. Around him, hundreds of people stirred, their expressions a mirror of his own confusion. The sound of footsteps drew his attention. A line of masked figures entered, their uniforms pristine and their movements eerily synchronized. At their head was a man in a black mask, his presence commanding and unnerving. "Welcome," the man said, his voice calm yet menacing. "You have all been chosen to participate in a series of games. Win, and you will receive a life-changing fortune. Lose, and you will be eliminated." The word hung heavy in the air, asterisk. Eliminated star. Gi-hun's stomach churned as the man continued, explaining the rules with an unsettling precision. There was no escape, no room for dissent. They were trapped, bound by their desperation and the promise of wealth. Gi-hun's gaze drifted to the massive piggy bank suspended above the room. It was empty now, but the man promised it would soon overflow with riches. The sight was both alluring and ominous, a symbol of the stakes they faced. As the masked figures departed, the contestants exchanged wary glances. Whispers filled the air, a mix of speculation and fear. Gi-hun felt a knot tighten in his chest. He had entered a game, but it was no ordinary contest. It was a gamble, one that would demand far more than he had bargained for. Chapter 2. Red Light, Green Light. The room hummed with a restless energy as Song Gi-hun sat on the edge of his cot, staring at the sea of faces around him. Hundreds of strangers in matching green tracksuits, each bearing a number stitched across their chests, shuffled and whispered nervously. Above them, the enormous piggy bank loomed ominously, an empty promise hanging like a storm cloud. Every glance exchanged in the sterile dormitory seemed weighted with unspoken fears. No one dared to speak too loudly, not under the watchful eyes of the masked guards who stood silent and immovable at every exit. Their crimson uniforms were pristine, their angular black masks devoid of any humanity. Gi-hun tried not to look at them for too long. There was something in their stillness that made his skin crawl. "Attention, players." The voice was a jarring intrusion, disembodied and cold, echoing across the room. All murmurs ceased. Gi-hun's heart thudded in his chest as he looked toward the source, a masked figure, different from the others, in a black uniform that exuded authority. This was the front man. "You will now proceed to the first game. Follow the staff's instructions carefully. Those who fail to comply will be eliminated." The word echoed in Gi-hun's mind, eliminated. He had heard it before, but now it carried a sharper edge. A chill ran down his spine as the guards began to move, their silent commands urging the players toward a set of doors that had opened at the far end of the room. The crowd shuffled forward, uneasy and reluctant, like cattle being herded to slaughter. Gi-hun found himself caught in the current, his feet moving without thought. The murmurs around him were tinged with nervous laughter and attempts at bravado, but no one seemed at ease. The corridor they entered was sterile and brightly lit, its stark white walls devoid of any warmth. The line of players stretched endlessly, the green of their uniforms contrasting sharply with the red of the guards. Gi-hun's eyes darted to the numbers on their chests: 101, 218, 067, 199, each one a symbol of their shared anonymity. "Hey," a voice said softly beside him. Gi-hun turned to see a familiar face, Cho Sang-woo, a childhood friend he hadn't seen in years. Sang-woo's face was calm, almost eerily so, his sharp eyes scanning their surroundings with calculated precision. "Sang-woo," Gi-hun whispered, his voice tinged with disbelief. "What are you doing here?" "The same as you," Sang-woo replied simply. His tone was clipped, giving nothing away. "I need the money." Gi-hun wanted to press further, but the doors at the end of the corridor opened, and the players were ushered into a massive outdoor arena. The sight before them was surreal. A sprawling field bathed in artificial sunlight, its boundaries marked by towering walls painted like a child's idyllic drawing. A giant robotic doll stood at the far end, its oversized head and cartoonish features strangely unsettling. "Red light, green light," the voice announced. Confusion rippled through the crowd. Gi-hun's brow furrowed as he tried to make sense of the scene. Was this a game? It looked harmless enough, but the tension in the air suggested otherwise. "The rules are simple," the voice continued. "When the doll says green light, you may move toward the finish line. When it says red light, you must stop. If you are caught moving during red light, you will be eliminated." The doll's head swiveled, its lifeless eyes scanning the players. Gi-hun felt a bead of sweat roll down his temple as he exchanged a glance with Sang-woo. The unease in his friend's expression mirrored his own. The game began abruptly. "Green light," the doll sang, its childlike voice cheerful and melodic. The players hesitated for a moment before cautiously moving forward. Gi-hun took a tentative step, his heart pounding. "Red light." The doll's voice was sharp now, and the crowd froze. Gi-hun stood rigid, his breath caught in his throat. For a brief moment, everything was silent. Then, the sound of gunfire shattered the air. A player near the front collapsed, their body crumpling to the ground. The crowd gasped collectively, horror spreading like wildfire. Gi-hun's eyes widened as he saw the blood pooling beneath the fallen player. They're dead," someone whispered, the words barely audible over the rising panic. "Green light." The doll's voice interrupted the chaos, and a few players began to move again, though their steps were shaky. Gi-hun's legs felt like lead, his mind screaming at him to run, but his body paralyzed by fear. "Red light." Another round of shots rang out. More players fell, their lifeless bodies scattered across the field. The realization hit Gi-hun like a freight train. This wasn't just a game. This was a massacre disguised as entertainment. "Move," Sang-woo hissed, grabbing Gi-hun's arm. "We have to keep moving, or we're next." The urgency in Sang-woo's voice jolted Gi-hun into action. He forced his legs to move, each step feeling heavier than the last. Around him, players stumbled and fell, their terror palpable. The game continued, the doll's voice alternating between its sing-song green light and the chilling red light. Gi-hun focused all his energy on staying still during the pauses, his body trembling with adrenaline. He glanced to his side and saw a young woman, Kang Bayak, moving with a precision that bordered on mechanical. Her expression was cold and detached, her every motion calculated. Further ahead, a burly man shoved another player aside, his desperation overriding any sense of morality. The finish line seemed impossibly far away, each step a gamble between survival and death. Gi-hun's breaths came in short, ragged gasps as he edged closer, his mind screaming at him to keep going. By the final stretch, the field was littered with bodies. The surviving players were few, their faces pale and etched with shock. Gi-hun felt a surge of determination as he approached the line, his steps quickening despite the weight of his fear. Green light. He sprinted the last few meters, crossing the finish line just as the doll announced, red light. He collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving as relief and horror washed over him. The game ended as abruptly as it had begun. Those who had failed to cross in time were eliminated, their fates sealed. The survivors stood in stunned silence, their minds struggling to process the carnage they had witnessed. Gi-hun looked back at the field, the weight of the deaths around him pressing heavily on his chest. This was no ordinary competition. It was a nightmare, one from which there was no escape. As the guards herded them back to the dormitory, Gi-hun's thoughts raced. He had entered this game for the promise of wealth, but now he understood the true cost. Winning meant surviving. Losing meant death. And this was only the beginning. Chapter 3. A Pact of Desperation. The dormitory was a mausoleum of silence. The remaining players, just over 200 now, sat on their cots, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes hollow. The events of the day had stripped them of any illusions. What had once seemed like an opportunity, a chance to rewrite their lives, had revealed itself as something monstrous. Survival was no longer just a goal. It was the only goal. Song Gi-hun sat on his cot, trembling, his mind replaying the game in an endless, torturous loop. The crack of gunfire, the bodies collapsing onto the ground, the blood soaking into the earth. All of it was seared into his memory. He glanced at his hands and noticed they were still shaking. He clenched them into fists, trying to steady himself, but the tremors persisted. He looked around, scanning the faces of his fellow players. Each one carried the same expression, a mixture of fear, shock, and a grim determination. Some whispered among themselves in hushed tones. Others sat in isolation, staring into the distance. Across the room, he spotted Cho Sang-woo, his childhood friend. Sang-woo's face was calm, almost unnervingly so, as he quietly observed the others. Gi-hun wanted to approach him, to seek comfort in the familiarity of his presence, but something about Sang-woo's demeanor made him hesitate. Before Gi-hun could make a decision, the metallic clanging of a loudspeaker shattered the silence. "Attention, players," the disembodied voice announced. "You have successfully completed the first game. A total of 255 players have been eliminated. 201 players remain." The number hit Gi-hun like a punch to the gut. 255 lives snuffed out in a single afternoon. He had barely noticed how many had fallen. He had been too focused on survival. Now the weight of that loss settled heavily on his shoulders. To commemorate your success, we will now add the prize money for the first game to the pot. All heads turned upward as the massive piggy bank suspended above the room began to fill. The sound of coins cascading into the glass was oddly mechanical, yet mesmerizing. Gi-hun watched as the numbers on the electronic display climbed higher and higher. 25.5 billion won, the voice declared. Gasps rippled through the room. The sum was staggering, a fortune beyond imagination. For a brief moment, the tension in the air shifted. Greed flickered in the players' eyes, overshadowing their fear. Gi-hun felt it too, a pull, a whisper in the back of his mind. That money could change everything. It could erase his debts, give his daughter a better life, restore his dignity. But then he remembered the field of bodies, and the thought curdled in his stomach. As the guards filed into the room, the voice spoke again. "You will now have time to rest before the next game. Take this opportunity to recover and prepare." The players murmured uneasily as the guards exited, leaving them to their thoughts. The dormitory buzzed with a low hum of conversation as alliances began to form. Gi-hun noticed groups clustering together, whispering furtively. He couldn't help but wonder how much trust could exist in a place like this. "Gi-hun." The voice startled him. He turned to see Sang-woo standing nearby, his expression unreadable. "Sang-woo," Gi-hun said, forcing a weak smile. "You okay?" Sang-woo nodded. "I'm fine. We need to talk." Gi-hun followed him to a quieter corner of the room, away from prying ears. Sang-woo's gaze was intense, his voice low. "We need to form a group," he said. "It's too dangerous to be alone. We don't know what the next game will be, but it's clear they're trying to weed us out. Strength in numbers could be the difference between life and death." Gi-hun hesitated. He had known Sang-woo for years, but something about his calm, calculating demeanor unsettled him. Still, Sang-woo's logic was sound. "All right," Gi-hun said finally. "But who else can we trust?" As if in answer, a voice cut in. "You'll need more than just brains and luck." The speaker was a burly man with a shaved head and a predatory grin, Jang Deok-soo, the gangster who had shoved his way to survival during the first game. Gi-hun tensed instinctively, but Sang-woo remained calm. "You're suggesting an alliance?" Sang-woo asked coolly. Deok-soo shrugged. "I don't care about trust. I care about staying alive. You two seem smart enough to know that teaming up is the best shot we've got." Gi-hun didn't trust Deok-soo, but before he could voice his concerns, another figure approached. A young man with kind eyes and a hesitant smile. It was Ali Abdul, the player who had saved Gi-hun from falling during the first game. "May I join?" Ali asked. "I don't have anyone here, but I want to help." Gi-hun smiled despite himself. Ali's sincerity was a welcome contrast to Deok-soo's brashness. "Of course," he said, glancing at Sang-woo for confirmation. Sang-woo nodded, though his eyes lingered on Deok-soo, wary. Their group was taking shape, an uneasy alliance of necessity. As the night stretched on, Gi-hun tried to sleep, but the tension in the room made it impossible. Whispers of suspicion and fear filled the air, mingling with the occasional muffled sob. He lay awake, his mind racing. Suddenly, a scream pierced the darkness. Gi-hun bolted upright, his heart pounding. Chaos erupted as players scrambled to their feet, their faces pale with terror. In the center of the room, a man lay sprawled on the ground, blood pooling beneath him. A knife glinted in the dim light, clenched in the hand of another player. The guards stormed in, their presence silencing the room instantly. The killer was dragged away without ceremony, leaving the rest of the players shaken. Gi-hun exchanged a glance with Sang-woo. The message was clear. The games weren't the only danger. As dawn approached, the players were once again summoned to the arena. The atmosphere was heavier now, the weight of the previous night's violence pressing down on them. Gi-hun felt a knot tighten in his stomach as they entered another surreal game space, a vast playground filled with oversized equipment. The rules of the next game were explained. Players were to choose one of four shapes: circle, triangle, star, or umbrella, without knowing what the game entailed. The group hesitated, their eyes darting between the options. Deok-soo, confident as ever, chose the triangle. Ali, trusting Gi-hun, followed his lead in selecting the umbrella. As the game began, the players were handed a small tin containing a piece of honeycomb candy. The goal was simple but brutal: carve the chosen shape out of the candy without breaking it. Gi-hun's heart sank as he stared at the delicate umbrella etched into his candy. The intricate curves and narrow lines seemed impossible to navigate. Around him, players were already breaking their pieces, their cries of despair followed swiftly by gunfire. His hands trembled as he worked, the needle scraping against the brittle surface. Sweat dripped down his face, mixing with the tears he didn't realize were falling. Time ticked away mercilessly. Desperation clawed at Gi-hun as the edges of his candy began to crack. He glanced up, his mind racing. That's when he saw it, the faint glimmer of an idea. He licked the candy, letting his saliva soften the brittle edges. Slowly, painstakingly, the umbrella began to take shape. Others noticed his technique, following suit. But not everyone was so lucky. When the timer finally buzzed, the survivors were far fewer than before. Gi-hun slumped to the ground, the umbrella still intact in his trembling hands. Relief flooded him, but it was short-lived. As the guards escorted them back to the dormitory, the reality sank in. They had survived, but only just. The second game had claimed its share of lives, and the stakes were rising. The games were not just tests of skill. They were designed to exploit every ounce of desperation and fear. Gi-hun glanced at his group, his gaze lingering on Sang-woo. He had agreed to this alliance for survival, but trust was a fragile thing in a world like this. And the next game was always just around the corner. Chapter 4: The Tug of War. The dormitory was colder than ever, the air thick with dread and unease. The once constant murmurs among the players had all but ceased, replaced by a suffocating silence. With the second game behind them, the survivors, now fewer than 100, sat scattered in small groups, their faces shadowed by exhaustion and paranoia. Gi-hun leaned against the wall of his cot, his hands folded tightly as he watched his newfound allies. Cho Sang-woo sat cross-legged on a cot, deep in thought, his eyes fixed on the floor. Ali Abdul, ever the optimist, was rummaging through his pocket for the meager crumbs of bread he had saved from dinner. Jang Deok-soo, the burly gangster, stood near the door, his eyes darting toward the guards. He was restless, like a predator waiting for its moment to strike. Kong Se-byok, the quiet and guarded pickpocket, was the last to join their group. She sat a few feet away from the others, sharpening the edge of a spoon she'd stolen from dinner. Her distrust of everyone, even her supposed allies, was palpable. Gi-hun exhaled deeply, trying to push back the suffocating weight of the games. "What do you think the next game will be?" he asked, his voice breaking the silence. Sang-woo looked up sharply, his expression grave. "We can't know. But whatever it is, it'll test more than just luck. It's designed to push us to the edge." "I'm not sure I can handle another game like the last one," Ollie admitted, his voice trembling. "You'll handle it," Deok-soo growled. "Or you'll die like the others. That's how it works." Gi-hun's stomach twisted at the gangster's bluntness, but he knew Deok-soo was right. There was no room for weakness here, not if they wanted to survive. Before anyone could respond, the metallic clang of the loudspeaker echoed through the room. "Attention, players. The third game will begin shortly. Please proceed to the staging area." The dormitory doors creaked open, and the guards filed in, their black masks and crimson uniforms as intimidating as ever. The players rose reluctantly, their movements slow and weighted. Gi-hun felt his legs shake beneath him, but he forced himself to stand. The group stuck together as they were herded down a sterile corridor. Gi-hun glanced nervously at the others, his heart pounding. He could feel the weight of unspoken fears pressing down on them all. They entered the new game arena, a massive, high-ceilinged room filled with an eerie white light. Suspended in the center of the room was a narrow platform, stretching across a seemingly bottomless pit. On either side of the platform, thick ropes were tied to metal fixtures embedded in the walls. "Tug of war," the voice announced coldly. The players exchanged confused and wary glances. Gi-hun's mind raced. Tug of war? It seemed almost comical, given the stakes, but he knew better by now. Nothing in this place was simple. "You will form teams of 10, the voice continued. "Each team will compete in a match of tug of war. The losing team will be eliminated." The word eliminated hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Gi-hun's chest tightened as he realized the implication. Half of them would die in this game. The players began scrambling to form teams. Gi-hun clung tightly to his group, ensuring they stayed together. They had 6 members: himself, Sang-woo, Ali, Deok-soo, Se-byok, and an elderly man named Oh-il-nam, whose frailty and gentle demeanor made him seem an unlikely candidate for survival. "We need 4 more, Sang-woo said urgently, scanning the crowd. Deok-soo growled in frustration. "Why should we bother? Half these idiots can't pull their own weight." "We need a full team," Sang-woo snapped. "Or we're dead before we start." Reluctantly, they added 4 more players to their group. 2 women and 2 men who had been left without alliances. They were strangers, their faces unfamiliar and their loyalty unproven. But there was no time to be selective. Once the teams were formed, the guards began directing them onto the platform. Gi-hun's team was led to one side, while their opponents, a group of burly men who looked far stronger, were stationed on the other. Gi-hun's stomach dropped. This wasn't a fair match. The whistle blew, and the game began. The rope burned against Gi-hun's palms as he gripped it tightly, his arms trembling with the strain. The opposing team heaved with brutal force, and Gi-hun's team was yanked forward, their feet sliding across the platform. "Hold on," Sang-woo shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Don't pull all at once. Hold your ground." Gi-hun gritted his teeth, planting his feet firmly on the ground. Around him, his teammates were struggling, their faces contorted with effort. Even Deok-soo, as strong as he was, looked strained. "Lean back," Sang-woo yelled. "Use your weight to counter them." The team obeyed, shifting their weight backward. It worked, if only for a moment. The rope stopped moving, and they managed to regain a bit of footing. But the other team was relentless. They pulled with savage strength, their sheer power threatening to drag Gi-hun's team off the platform entirely. "We're losing," Ali cried, his voice desperate. Gi-hun's mind raced, searching for a solution. Then he remembered something the old man, Nam, had mentioned earlier, almost as an afterthought. Tug of war isn't just about strength, Nam had said. It's about strategy. You need to work together to outthink your opponents. And sometimes the best move is to let go. The words echoed in Gi-hun's mind, and he made a snap decision. Let go, he shouted. The team hesitated, confused and terrified. Trust me, Gi-hun yelled. Reluctantly, they obeyed, loosening their grip on the rope. The sudden lack of resistance caught the opposing team off guard, and they stumbled backward, their balance disrupted. Now pull, Gi-hun roared. With renewed effort, the team heaved the rope with all their strength. The opposing team, still reeling from the unexpected shift, was dragged forward. One by one, they lost their footing and tumbled over the edge, their screams echoing as they disappeared into the abyss. Gi-hun collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. Around him, his teammates were equally drained, their faces pale with exhaustion and relief. They had won. They had survived. But the cost was unbearable. Gi-hun glanced at the other side of the platform, where the losing team had stood just moments ago. The emptiness there was haunting. As the guards led them back to the dormitory, the survivors were silent. The cheers and celebrations that might have followed a victory in another world were absent here. There was no joy in survival, only the grim understanding that the games were far from over. Gi-hun lay awake that night, his mind racing. He thought of the people he had just helped kill, of their faces and their desperate struggles. He thought of his daughter, of the promise he had made to her to come back. And he thought of the games yet to come, each one more brutal and unforgiving than the last. In this place, victory and survival were one and the same, but each victory left a deeper scar. Chapter 5: The Masked Game. The days that followed the third game blurred into one another, a haze of uncertainty, fear, and fatigue. The remaining players had dwindled to just over 50, each one clinging to life with varying degrees of desperation. The events of the past games weighed heavily on them, and the unspoken truth had begun to settle in. This place was not just a competition. It was a slaughterhouse, and they were the cattle. Song Gi-hun sat in the corner of the dormitory, staring into the void. The tension in the room was palpable, each player alone in their thoughts, haunted by the knowledge that every minute brought them closer to the next game. He glanced over at his makeshift group. Cho Sang-woo, Ali Abdul, Kang Se-byak, and Jang Deok-soo. Their faces were grim, the usual wariness of the game replaced by an undercurrent of something darker. Trust was a commodity that could no longer be given freely, and alliances were fragile, held together only by necessity. Gi-hun couldn't help but feel the pull of his growing anxiety. Each game had tested their survival, but what would the next one bring? How much more could they endure before they broke? He knew, though, that he had no choice but to keep moving forward. There were no other options in a place like this. The silence in the dormitory was broken when the loudspeaker crackled to life. The voice, mechanical and cold, echoed through the room like a death sentence. Attention, players. The fourth game will begin shortly. Please proceed to the staging area. Gi-hun's heart skipped a beat. He stood slowly, glancing around at the others. Their faces were a mixture of dread and resolve, each one steeling themselves for the unknown. The guards entered, their presence commanding the room, their guns slung over their shoulders like the weight of fate itself. They were escorted to another arena, the walls lined with screens that flickered with static, casting an eerie glow over the vast space. As they were led to their designated spots, Gi-hun couldn't shake the feeling that something was different about this game. The atmosphere was heavier, more oppressive. The voice came again. Welcome to the fourth game. This game will require teamwork and precision. The game is simple. A team of two will compete against another team. You will be blindfolded. The objective is to retrieve a flag from the other team's side of the arena. The first team to do so will win. The losing team will be eliminated. Gi-hun's stomach churned. Blindfolded? The mere thought was enough to make his pulse race. It wasn't just a physical challenge. This was a test of trust, of reliance on others. In a game like this, trust was a dangerous thing to give. The players were paired off. Sang-woo glanced at Gi-hun, and without a word, they silently agreed to partner up. Ali and Se-byak were paired as well, and Deok-soo, unsurprisingly, was left to team up with another player who had no one else to turn to. Gi-hun's mind raced as the blindfolds were slipped over their eyes. The world around him dissolved into darkness, the sounds of his breathing, the shuffle of feet, and the faint rustle of clothing the only things that anchored him to reality. He could feel the weight of the blindfold pressing against his face, and it seemed to amplify every sensation. His hands clenched into fists, the anticipation gnawing at him. He heard the whistle blow, signaling the start of the game. The arena was quiet, too quiet. His heart pounded in his chest as he took a cautious step forward, trying to steady his breathing. He could hear Sang-woo beside him, moving with careful precision, each footstep deliberate. "Stay close," Sang-woo's voice came, calm and controlled, though it held an edge of urgency. "We need to work together." Gi-hun nodded, even though Sang-woo couldn't see him. The bond between them was fragile, but it was there, forged in the heat of survival. They had already been through so much together. There was no time for doubts now. The sound of movement from the other side of the arena caught his attention. The other team was close too. Gi-hun felt a surge of adrenaline and gripped Sang-woo's arm tighter, signaling him to stop. They had to move strategically. Suddenly, a cry pierced the air. One of the other teams had made contact. The clashing of bodies, the frantic scuffling, it was all happening around him, a chaotic blur in the dark. "Gi-hun," Sang-woo said sharply. "We need to find the flag." The words hit Gi-hun like a jolt of electricity, and he began to move again, his hands outstretched, feeling for any sign of the flag. The arena felt impossibly vast, each step a gamble. He could hear the sound of other players moving, the rustling of clothing, the frantic whispers of strategy. He had to focus, had to shut out everything except the task at hand. Time seemed to stretch, each second drawn out into infinity. He stumbled forward, his foot catching on something, an obstacle in the dark. He gritted his teeth, righting himself, and continued. Then suddenly a shout rang out. "I found it!" Sang-woo's voice, sharp with triumph. Gi-hun felt a surge of relief, a wave of exhilaration sweeping over him. They had found the flag. But it wasn't over yet. There was a rush of movement as the other team descended upon them. Gi-hun's breath caught in his throat as he heard the thud of feet, the sound of desperate scrambling. He felt a tug on his arm, and in that moment his blindfold slipped slightly, just enough to catch a glimpse of something in the corner of his vision. A blur, a figure moving rapidly toward them. The next moments were a blur of chaos. A hand grabbed his arm, yanking him forward, but Gi-hun wasn't sure if it was Sang-woo or someone from the other team. He struggled against the pull, disoriented by the sudden rush of motion. He heard the unmistakable crack of a fist hitting flesh and the sound of a body hitting the ground. "Sang-woo," Gi-hun called, panic rising in his chest. But there was no response. The world around him was too loud, too fast, and all he could do was hold onto the flag, the one thing that could save them. His grip tightened, and in that moment, he realized just how fragile his hold on survival was. The game seemed to go on forever, the sounds of battle surrounding him. Finally, there was a sharp whistle. The game was over. Gi-hun's chest heaved with exertion as the blindfold was removed. He blinked against the sudden light, his eyes adjusting. Sang-woo stood beside him, a fierce determination in his eyes. They had done it, they had won. But at what cost? The other team lay scattered across the arena, their bodies crumpled and still. Gi-hun's stomach turned at the sight, but he couldn't afford to dwell on it. He turned to Sang-woo, his heart still racing. "We won. But how many more of these games can we survive?" Sang-woo's expression was unreadable, his eyes narrowed in thought. "One game at a time. That's all we can do." Gi-hun nodded, though doubt gnawed at him. He didn't know if he could keep going. Each game, each victory, was a reminder that death was never far behind. As they were escorted back to the dormitory, Gi-hun's thoughts turned to the future. The games had already taken so much from him: his innocence, his sense of morality, his belief in a just world. What would be left of him when it was over? But there was no turning back. The only way out of this place was through. And with every step, he knew one thing. In this game, survival wasn't just about strength or strategy. It was about who you could trust and who you would betray. Chapter 6: The Glass Bridge. The sound of their footsteps echoed through the cold, sterile corridors as the players were led to their next game. A sense of unease settled heavily over them. For most, the previous challenges had left scars, both physical and mental. The few who had made it this far were battle-worn, their eyes hollow with the weight of what they had endured. The games were no longer just a means to an end. They had become a daily reminder of how fragile life had become. Gi-hun's heart hammered in his chest as they walked, his thoughts scattered. The events of the last game still haunted him. The blindness, the chaos, and the desperate struggle for survival had drained him. He had won, but he had seen the look in Sang-woo's eyes, the same look of determination that had been there from the very first game. It was the look of someone willing to do anything to survive, and Gi-hun wasn't sure if he could trust that anymore. The alliances, once formed out of necessity, were beginning to feel more like ticking time bombs. Everyone had their own agenda now. "What do you think this game will be?" Ollie asked, his voice quiet but laced with anxiety. He had never been one for confrontation, but after the last game, even his usual optimism had been dulled. "I don't know," Gi-hun muttered, his eyes scanning the surroundings. The walls of the corridor were still adorned with the same cold, unfeeling symmetry, but there was something different this time. The air was thicker, heavier. It felt as if they were walking into the maw of some monstrous machine, its gears slowly turning, grinding everything in its path. Sang-woo, who had been unusually quiet, glanced over at Gi-hun. "It doesn't matter. Whatever it is, we'll face it head-on. Together." There was a strange edge to his voice, something Gi-hun couldn't quite place. He was starting to realize just how different the man standing beside him was from the one he had known outside these walls. Survival was changing them all. Finally, they reached the staging area, where the other players had already gathered. It was a vast, open space, far larger than any of the previous arenas. The center was dominated by a large structure, its towering pillars stretching upward, and in the middle, a narrow bridge. The sight made Gi-hun's stomach drop. "This doesn't look good," Deok-soo muttered from behind them. "I agree," S.A. Byok replied, her voice as cold as ever. She had been quiet since the last game, but there was an intensity in her eyes now that Gi-hun couldn't ignore. A loudspeaker crackled to life, the voice as emotionless as ever. "Welcome to the 6th game. You will now compete in the glass bridge." Gi-hun blinked, confused. "A bridge? What kind of game was that?" The voice continued. "There are 2 types of glass tiles on the bridge. One is tempered glass, the other is regular glass. The tempered glass can withstand the weight of a person. The regular glass will break under the weight of even one. You must cross the bridge in pairs. The first pair to reach the other side will win. The losers will be eliminated." Gi-hun's breath hitched. The enormity of the game slowly began to sink in. A glass bridge? And they had to cross it without knowing which tiles would hold their weight? The odds were impossible. He turned to Sang-woo, his eyes wide with fear, but Sang-woo was already calculating, his mind racing as always. "Who goes first?" Gi-hun asked, his voice tight with dread. Sang-woo met his gaze, and for a moment, Gi-hun thought he saw something in his eyes, something that made him uneasy. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "We don't have time to waste," Sang-woo said. "We'll go first. We can figure it out." Gi-hun didn't protest. There was no time for hesitation, not now. They had to survive. As they stepped onto the bridge, the glass beneath their feet seemed impossibly fragile. The sound of their shoes clicking against the surface echoed in the air, too loud in the tense silence that surrounded them. Gi-hun could feel his heart racing in his chest, each step sending a jolt of fear through his body. "How do we know which glass is safe?" Gi-hun asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sang-woo didn't respond immediately, his eyes scanning the bridge ahead. "We don't," he said finally. "But we can make a guess. Just trust me." Gi-hun nodded, though the doubt gnawed at him. Trust. What did that even mean now? They were all playing a game where the only guarantee was that someone had to die. There was no room for trust. And yet, somehow, they had survived this far by relying on each other. Sang-woo stepped forward first, his movements slow and deliberate. He placed his foot on the first glass tile, testing its strength. It held. A small sigh of relief escaped Gi-hun's lips, but it was fleeting. The game wasn't over yet. "One step at a time," Sang-woo muttered. "We just need to keep moving." They moved forward carefully, one step after another, each one calculated. The tension was unbearable. Gi-hun's heart pounded in his ears, and he could feel the sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. The sound of their footsteps on the glass tiles was amplified in the silence, each one a reminder of how fragile their situation was. The first tile held, and the next. But then the third tile cracked. Gi-hun froze, his heart stopping for a split second as he watched the crack spread across the surface. "Move," Sang-woo hissed, yanking Gi-hun forward. Gi-hun stumbled, barely keeping his balance, but he didn't fall. He felt the bridge sway beneath him, a sickening sensation that made his stomach lurch. They kept moving, faster now, their steps quickening as they passed more tiles. Each one was a gamble, a terrifying leap of faith. The other players behind them were becoming more desperate, watching their every move. Gi-hun could hear their footsteps now, racing behind him, each player hoping to catch a glimpse of what tiles would hold their weight. But it was impossible to know. As they reached the halfway point, Gi-hun felt a pang of guilt. Behind them, other teams were watching, waiting for a sign. The pressure was mounting, and the stakes were only getting higher. They had reached the final stretch. Only a few more steps to safety. Gi-hun's breath came in shallow gasps, and his hands were slick with sweat as he gripped the edges of the bridge. "Just a little further," Sang-woo said, his voice strained but steady. Gi-hun didn't know how much more he could take. His body felt like it was made of glass, fragile and ready to shatter. Every fiber of his being screamed to turn back, to run. But there was no way back. They made it. Sang-woo's foot landed on the final platform, and they both staggered to safety, collapsing onto solid ground. They had made it across. But the other players, those who had been behind them, were not so lucky. The sound of glass shattering behind them was deafening, and Gi-hun turned just in time to see bodies falling, screams echoing as the bridge's fragile tiles gave way beneath their weight. The players who hadn't made it across were now gone, eliminated in an instant. Gi-hun felt the bile rise in his throat as he watched them fall, their bodies disappearing into the darkness below. He looked away quickly, his mind racing. How many more had died? How many more would die before this nightmare was over? But the game wasn't over. The loudspeaker crackled to life once again, announcing the winners and the losers, but Gi-hun's mind couldn't focus on the words. He was still in shock, still reeling from the horror he had just witnessed. Survival had never felt so empty. As the players who had crossed the bridge gathered together, the remaining contestants who hadn't made it were quietly escorted away, their faces vacant, their deaths nothing more than a part of the game's cruel rhythm. Gi-hun and Sang-woo exchanged a look, but there was no relief in their eyes. The victory felt hollow. "We're one step closer," Sang-woo muttered. Gi-hun nodded, but the weight of what they had just experienced settled heavily on his shoulders. In this place, victory didn't bring peace. It only brought more fear, more death. And with each game, Gi-hun felt himself slipping further away from the man he used to be. The games had become more than just a test of survival. They had become a mirror, reflecting the darkest parts of the players, part of them that had been buried long ago. And in this place, there was no escape. Chapter 7. The Maze of Mirrors. The days blurred together after the glass bridge game. Every step seemed to pull them further from any sense of normalcy, and yet, despite the terror and the death surrounding them, the players trudged forward, one foot in front of the other, as if driven by some primal instinct to survive. The games were relentless, a new nightmare each time. Song Gi-hun, who had once been full of hope and optimism, now found his thoughts consumed with one thing: the next game. He couldn't afford to be caught off guard again. His body was bruised, battered, and his spirit was nearly broken, but he was still alive. That was the only thing that mattered now. Sang-woo had become more distant, his mind constantly working, calculating their chances. At first, Gi-hun had admired his friend's ability to think strategically, but now he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease around him. It was as if the games had turned Sang-woo into something else, someone willing to go to any lengths to win, even if it meant losing the last vestiges of humanity. It was with a heavy heart that Gi-hun followed Sang-woo and the others as they made their way to the next arena. There was no turning back. This was the only path they could take now, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could continue on it. The voice from the loudspeaker crackled to life as they arrived at the next game's staging area. "Attention, players. Welcome to the 7th game. This will be a test of your mind and your ability to think clearly under pressure. You will enter the maze of mirrors. The objective is simple: navigate your way through the maze and reach the exit. However, there's a catch. The maze will constantly shift, and the mirrors will distort your sense of reality. If you fail to reach the exit in time, you will be eliminated." Gi-hun felt a chill crawl down his spine. The maze of mirrors sounded like a cruel joke. How could anyone navigate through a maze that could change at any moment, let alone in a place like this, where every step could be their last? They were led into the arena, a large, dimly lit space filled with towering mirrors. The walls gleamed, but the reflections were distorted, creating an unnerving sense of confusion. As they entered, the metallic scent of the air filled Gi-hun's nostrils, and his heartbeat quickened. The door slammed shut behind them, and the loudspeaker spoke again. You have 15 minutes to reach the exit. The maze will shift at random intervals. The first one to reach the exit will win. The rest, well, you know the rules. Gi-hun's mind raced as he tried to process the new challenge. Mirrors, shifting walls, and a ticking clock. It was a nightmare. But the worst part? He knew there was no way out unless he made it to the exit. And even then, who knew if it was truly an exit, or just another trap waiting to ensnare them? Stick close, Sang-woo whispered, his eyes scanning the maze ahead. Gi-hun nodded, though his mind wasn't entirely on Sang-woo's words. He was distracted by the mirrors, which reflected his image back at him from every angle. They were disorienting, creating multiple versions of himself, all of them staring back with wide, hollow eyes. For a moment, Gi-hun could hardly tell which way to go. His legs felt heavy, like they were made of stone, and his breath came in shallow gasps as his anxiety took hold. But he couldn't afford to lose focus. He had to keep moving. The maze was silent at first, save for the sound of their footsteps and the occasional creaking of the mirrors as they shifted. Every step felt like a step into the unknown. The walls seemed to close in around him, and he had to remind himself to breathe. There was no escape but forward. Then suddenly a mirror to his left shimmered. It didn't just reflect his image. It reflected the image of someone else, someone standing just a few steps behind him. Gi-hun turned quickly, but no one was there. His pulse quickened. Was it just his mind playing tricks on him, or was something more sinister at play? The mirrors were distorting everything, making him doubt his own perception of reality. Gi-hun, Sang-woo called from ahead. Focus. Don't let the mirrors mess with your head. Gi-hun nodded, swallowing hard, and forced himself to look ahead. There was no time to waste. They had to make it through this maze, or they would be eliminated, just like so many others before them. As they pressed forward, the mirrors continued to shift, and the layout of the maze began to change. The walls seemed to move, reconfiguring in an almost impossible way. It was as if the maze was alive, shifting and breathing with them. Gi-hun's mind raced, trying to find patterns, but it was futile. The maze didn't follow any logic, any rules. There was no rhyme or reason to it, only endless mirrors that reflected his own confusion and fear. Left, Sang-woo shouted, and Gi-hun snapped back to attention, following his lead without question. They had no time to second-guess each other now. Every decision they made could mean the difference between life and death. They rounded a corner, and suddenly, the mirrors shifted again. The path ahead was blocked, and Gi-hun's heart sank as he realized they were stuck. We need to go back, he said, but Sang-woo shook his head. There's no time. We need to find another way. Gi-hun's eyes darted around, desperately searching for an exit, but there was nothing. Just more mirrors, more walls, all closing in on them. The air was thick, and his breathing became ragged as the sense of panic started to set in. And then, out of nowhere, the loudspeaker crackled again. 5 minutes remaining. You're running out of time. The clock was ticking. Their window was closing, and with each passing second, the walls seemed to shift even more violently. Gi-hun's thoughts raced, trying to keep up with the changing maze. The pressure was unbearable, and he could feel the weight of the entire game bearing down on him. Gi-hun, Sang-woo said urgently. We need to move. But Gi-hun couldn't move. He felt like his legs were frozen to the floor. His body refused to cooperate. His mind was filled with nothing but the overwhelming sensation of being trapped. The mirrors shifted again, and this time, they were no longer in the same place. Gi-hun's stomach dropped as he realized they had been separated. Sang-woo was on the other side of a wall, his figure a blurry reflection in the mirrors. The maze had split them apart. Gi-hun. Sang-woo shouted, his voice distant. Stay calm. We'll find each other. But Gi-hun's mind was already spiraling. The mirrors were no longer just an obstacle. They had become a prison, an endless labyrinth of confusion and fear. His heart raced, and his breath came in sharp, ragged gasps as he pushed forward, trying to make sense of the maze. He couldn't stop. He couldn't go back. He had to keep moving. With every turn, every corner, the maze shifted again, and the mirrors became more disorienting. His reflection was everywhere, surrounding him. There were endless versions of himself, each one staring back with cold, lifeless eyes. Gi-hun, Sang-woo's voice echoed in the distance. Focus. But Gi-hun was beyond focusing. The maze was a living, breathing thing, and it was closing in on him. There was no escape. Only endless mirrors, distorting his reality, pulling him deeper into a nightmare. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Gi-hun stumbled forward, his hands trembling as he reached for the next corner. The sound of glass shattering behind him made him jump, and he whirled around, heart hammering in his chest. He had no idea how much time was left. All he knew was that he couldn't stop. The maze was relentless, and with every second, he felt himself slipping further into the madness. But then, just as he thought he couldn't take another step, he saw it. The exit. A faint glimmer of light shining through the maze of mirrors. It was there, just ahead. And so, with everything he had left, Gi-hun took his final step. Gi-hun's heart pounded as his feet hit the ground, each step heavier than the last. The faint light grew brighter as he approached, a beacon in the suffocating darkness. The mirrors around him, once looming and disorienting, now seemed to retreat as if the light from the exit was pushing them away. His mind, clouded with exhaustion and panic, could only focus on the one goal, reaching the end. He didn't know how much time was left. The loudspeaker had stopped, its voice replaced by the unnerving stillness of the maze. The ticking of his own heartbeat drowned out everything else. The maze had shifted again, the mirrors creating more walls, more dead ends, but he pushed through it. There was no other option. The path ahead was narrow, but it was real. He could feel the air change, the pressure lifting with each step. As he neared the exit, something unexpected happened. His reflection in the mirrors, which had been scattered and fragmented, began to align with his movements. For the first time since entering the maze, Gi-hun saw himself clearly, not distorted, not multiplied, but as one. He was alone, separated from everyone, but it no longer felt like it. In the warped world of the maze, his own image had been the only thing constant, the only thing real. With one final, desperate burst of energy, he reached the last corner. And there, standing in front of him, was the exit. The door was not just a physical barrier. It was the line between survival and death, between freedom and the twisted continuation of the game. Gi-hun had no idea what waited on the other side, but he knew he had to push through. He threw himself at the door, his hands shaking as he reached for the handle. The moment his fingers made contact, the door swung open with a loud creak. Beyond it, there was no maze, no mirrors, only an empty room. Gi-hun stepped inside cautiously, his pulse racing. The door slammed shut behind him, cutting off any hope of returning. He turned around to find the walls closing in, but there was no way back, only forward. The room was silent, eerily so. But then the loudspeaker crackled again, its emotionless voice breaking the silence. Congratulations, player 456. You have successfully completed the 7th game and reached the exit. You will now join the other winners. Gi-hun's breath hitched. He had made it. He had won the game, this round at least. But as the words sunk in, they didn't bring the relief he expected. Instead, a heavy weight settled on his chest. He had crossed the threshold of survival, but at what cost? The lives of others were shattered in his wake, their cries still ringing in his ears. He had won. But for what? As he stood there in the stillness, he became aware of the others. Some were standing near the far wall, their backs turned to him, while others sat on the cold floor, staring into nothingness. The defeated players from the maze had already been eliminated. It was the reality of the games. Each round whittled them down, not just physically, but mentally. No one was left unscathed. Gi-hun swallowed, trying to steady his breathing. He was alone in a room full of strangers, but he knew that they were all bound by the same unspoken understanding. In this place, trust was as fragile as the glass beneath their feet. Sang-woo was already in the room, standing with his back straight and his eyes sharp, as if the game had only made him more determined. He had made it, too. Of course he had. He had always been the one who thought ahead, who calculated each move with ruthless precision. Gi-hun didn't know whether to feel relieved or terrified by his presence. Sang-woo had become a symbol of survival, but at the cost of his soul, it seemed. The more he saw of Sang-woo's coldness, the more it chilled Gi-hun's spirit. Gi-hun, Sang-woo greeted him with a curt nod. We made it. Gi-hun didn't return the greeting immediately. Instead, his eyes flickered to the other players in the room. He couldn't help but wonder who they were. How many had made it this far? There were only a handful left now, each one as wary and battle-hardened as he was. Ese Bayok was sitting against the wall, her expression unreadable. She was calm, almost too calm, as if the horrors of the games had already become second nature to her. But when she met his eyes, something flickered in her gaze. A brief acknowledgement of the bond they had formed earlier in the games, a silent understanding that they had both been through hell. Ali, the Pakistani worker who had shown nothing but kindness and hope, was standing in the corner, his hands clasped together. His face was tense, and there was a sadness in his eyes that Gi-hun couldn't quite place. He wondered how much longer Ali's hope could survive in this place. Gi-hun walked over to him, his steps hesitant. "Ali, are you okay?" Ali didn't answer right away. His gaze was fixed on the floor, and for a moment, Gi-hun thought he wouldn't speak at all. But then, with a quiet sigh, he looked up. "Does it matter?" Ali's voice was hoarse, his usual warmth replaced with a weariness that seemed to have aged him overnight. "I don't know anymore. The world we came from, it's not here. We're in a different world now. One where the only thing that matters is staying alive. But at what cost?" He glanced at the others. "Is it worth it?" Gi-hun's throat tightened. Ali's question echoed in his mind, because he, too, had been wondering the same thing. Was it worth it? Surviving, only to lose everything that made him human? Before he could answer, the loudspeaker blared once again. "Players, please be seated. The next game will begin shortly." A chill ran down Gi-hun's spine. Another game. The stakes were always higher, the challenges more twisted. But how many more rounds could they endure? How many more lives would be lost before the end? He took a seat, his mind racing. The room seemed to grow colder with each passing second, the silence thickening as the remaining players gathered together. The realization hit him then. Every player in this room had become something more than human. They were survivors, but they were also monsters in their own right. No matter how hard they tried to hold on to who they once were, the games had changed them. And the longer they played, the more they would lose. It was a slow, inevitable erosion of everything they had been. As the lights flickered and the room shifted, Gi-hun looked around at the faces of the others, the few who had made it this far. They were all trapped, just like him, and the next game was already upon them. The clock was ticking, and the game would continue as it always did. Chapter 8. The Puppet Master's Game. The air was thick with anticipation. The lights overhead flickered for a brief moment, casting long, eerie shadows on the cold walls. Gi-hun's heart raced as the reality of what was happening, the endless games, dawned on him once again. He couldn't escape. He couldn't go back to the world he knew. And no matter how much he wished for it, there was no turning back the clock. He glanced at the others around him, all sitting in a circle, their faces a mixture of fear, exhaustion, and grim determination. Sang-woo sat with his back straight, arms folded, a mask of indifference on his face. Ese Bayok, ever the stoic survivor, seemed lost in thought, though her eyes, when they met Gi-hun's, spoke of a quiet, shared understanding. Ali was hunched over, his expression unreadable, while the others, some of the original players, some who had joined later, sat in tense silence. The loudspeaker blared again, its harsh mechanical voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. "Attention, players. The next game will begin in 5 minutes. Please remain in your seats." Gi-hun swallowed, feeling the dryness in his throat. There was no comfort in sitting. They all knew what came next, another round. Another challenge. And no matter how many times they had been through it, the feeling of dread never lessened. It was always worse the next time. Always more suffocating. He looked at the door, at the narrow slit of light that appeared beneath it, casting long shadows across the floor. There was no other exit, no other way out. Gi-hun's mind raced. What kind of game would it be this time? Would it be another test of strength or endurance, like the tug-of-war, or would it be more mental, like the glass bridge? He couldn't be sure, but something told him this next game would be different. They all were. There was no pattern, no way to predict what the next round would hold. All he could do was prepare himself. A shiver ran down his spine. What if it was worse than anything they had already faced? What if this game was designed to break them completely? As he pondered the possibilities, the doors to the room suddenly swung open with a loud crash, and 2 guards in their black masks stood at the entrance, blocking any hope of escape. They were not here to offer comfort or a way out. They were here to ensure that everyone played, whether they wanted to or not. The loudspeaker crackled to life once more. "Players, stand up and follow the guards. The game will begin shortly." Without a word, the players stood, their legs stiff and unsteady. Some of them exchanged uneasy glances. Others kept their eyes fixed on the ground, as if trying to avoid acknowledging the inevitable. Gi-hun felt the weight of his own fear pressing down on him, but he took a deep breath and followed the others as they were led out of the room. His mind was still spinning. The maze had been bad enough, but what could this next game possibly entail? The corridor they walked through seemed endless. The walls, cold and metallic, seemed to pulse with a quiet energy, the lights overhead flickering sporadically. The guards flanked them on either side, their faces hidden behind their featureless masks. Gi-hun had grown accustomed to them by now, their blank expressions always watching, always waiting. They reached a large, stark room, lit by harsh fluorescent lights that gave the entire place a clinical, soulless feel. In the center of the room was a raised platform, surrounded by tall, glass walls. At first, Gi-hun couldn't make sense of it. What kind of game was this? Then a figure appeared. A tall man in a black suit, his face obscured by a mask, stepped forward. He was calm, controlled, a stark contrast to the tension that had settled in the room. He didn't speak immediately, but when he did, his voice was smooth, almost rehearsed. "Welcome to the Puppet Master's game," he said, his tone chillingly neutral. "In this game, you will be tested not by physical strength, but by your ability to control and manipulate. You must work together, but you must also outthink one another. Your task is simple. The puppet will move according to your instructions. But you must choose wisely. If you make the wrong move, if you miscalculate, the puppet will fail and you will be eliminated." A low murmur rippled through the group. The words puppet and eliminated hung in the air, each more terrifying than the last. Gi-hun exchanged a glance with Sang-woo. Was this some kind of twisted game of control, where they had to direct someone else's actions? Or were they the ones being controlled? The puppet master gestured to the raised platform. At first, Gi-hun thought it was empty, but then, as the lights shifted, he saw it. A mannequin, sitting motionless in a chair at the center of the platform. It was a human-like figure, but its limbs were stiff and unnatural, like it had been crafted from some strange material that wasn't quite flesh, but something eerily close. The puppet master continued, his eyes scanning the players. "You will each take turns. The puppet will follow your commands, but it will also test your limits. You will have to make difficult choices. At each stage, you will face a dilemma, whether to push forward and risk failure or to hold back and risk losing your opportunity. There is no room for hesitation. And remember, if the puppet fails, you will fail." Gi-hun's stomach churned. He felt like he was being led into some kind of absurd nightmare, one where his mind was being toyed with just as much as the puppet's actions would be. The feeling of unease grew, and he couldn't shake the fear that the game was just a front for something far darker. "Begin," the puppet master said. The first player stepped forward. Gi-hun barely recognized him, a man who had joined the game late. He looked around, clearly confused, but his expression was quickly replaced by a determined frown. He faced the mannequin. "Move your right arm," the man ordered, his voice wavering slightly. The mannequin's arm remained still. It didn't respond. The man repeated the command, louder this time. Nothing happened. The puppet remained motionless. Gi-hun's pulse quickened. This was the game. It was simple, or so it seemed. But there was no way of knowing whether their actions would truly work, or whether the game had already set them up for failure. The puppet's arm finally jerked upward, but in a way that seemed wrong, unnatural, like it was being pulled by invisible strings. The man stepped back, his eyes wide. "This is absurd," he muttered, but the puppet master's voice rang out immediately. "Failure. Player 204 has been eliminated." The mannequin's stiff arm slowly dropped back to its side, and the room seemed to exhale as the man's body slumped to the floor in a heap. There was no sound from the guards, no sign of emotion from anyone. He was gone, just like that. The group stood in stunned silence. Gi-hun's breath caught in his throat. His mind was racing. The puppet master's game was not about control. It was about survival and manipulation and the unrelenting terror of failure. The next player stepped up, eyes wide, hands trembling as they prepared to take their turn. Gi-hun's gaze shifted to Sang-woo, who had been eerily quiet since the announcement. Gi-hun wanted to ask him what he thought, but he already knew the answer. Sang-woo had always been the strategist, the cold, calculating mind of their duo. But even he couldn't predict the twisted nature of this game. The sound of another command, another failed attempt, sent a ripple of horror through the group. And then, Gi-hun realized the horrible truth. No one was safe. And the puppet wasn't the only one being controlled. Chapter 9. The Final Test. The room was now silent, save for the soft hum of the lights above. Gi-hun could hear his own breath, shallow and quick, as he watched the puppet's still, lifeless form. His mind swirled with confusion, fear, and disbelief. Another player had been eliminated, just like that. One moment, they were alive, standing next to him, and the next, they were gone, swept away by the rules of this cruel game. The puppet master stood off to the side, watching the players with an expression of detached amusement. He was a figure of control, of calm in the chaos, and his silence was more unnerving than any words he could say. Gi-hun's thoughts raced. The rules were simple, but the reality of the game was far from straightforward. He couldn't help but feel the growing weight of the decision each player had to make. Every move they made now had consequences. If they chose wrong, if they miscalculated, there would be no going back. And in a place like this, failure meant death. It wasn't just a metaphor, it was a cold, unyielding truth. Bayak, sitting across from him, met his eyes for a brief moment, but there was no comfort there. She had become a hardened survivor since the early rounds, her trust in others having worn thin with every passing game. But she had also proven herself to be resourceful, intelligent, and determined, qualities that had kept her alive. Gi-hun knew that, deep down, she was just as terrified as he was. But unlike him, she had learned to hide it. Ali's hands trembled at his sides, his brow furrowed with anxiety. The young man from Pakistan had always been kind, even in the darkest of times, but the toll of the games was starting to show on him. The warmth in his eyes had faded, replaced with an expression that spoke of the uncertainty and fear gnawing at his soul. But it was Sang-woo who stood apart from the rest, his face a mask of cold calculation. He had already survived the most brutal games with his intellect, using others as pawns, outmaneuvering them when necessary. Gi-hun had watched helpless as Sang-woo's ruthlessness grew with each passing round. The desperation in his eyes had shifted into something darker, something unrecognizable. The next player stepped forward hesitantly, breaking the silence. A woman Gi-hun hadn't seen before, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She took a deep breath, her eyes flicking nervously from the puppet to the other players. This game was the great equalizer. No amount of strength or skill would help them now. It was a game of willpower, and more than anything, it was a game of mind games. She stood tall and took a few steadying breaths. "Move your left leg," she said, her voice surprisingly firm. The puppet, which had been completely still for so long, jerked into motion. Its leg lifted, stiff and unnaturally slow, before it dropped back down with a resounding thud. There was a collective sigh of relief from the group. A small victory, but it meant something. A moment of reprieve. But then a guard stepped forward, his masked face emotionless. He nodded to the puppet master, who made a slight motion of his hand. The woman looked confused, but before she could speak, the puppet master's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Failure. Player 235 has been eliminated." The puppet had failed to move properly. The arm that had been raised had been too slow, too stiff, and it had cost the player her life. Gi-hun's breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, the room seemed to tilt. This was madness. Every round, every game, brought more lives to the edge of destruction. The woman crumpled to the floor, her body motionless as the guards quickly carried her away. Gi-hun had seen enough death to last him a lifetime, but this felt different. She hadn't been given a chance. No one had. A few players glanced at one another nervously, but the mood in the room was now more somber than ever. Gi-hun's fingers clenched into fists. He couldn't just stand there, unable to act. He had to fight. He had to find a way to survive. If he didn't, he would become just another casualty of the game. Sang-woo was the next to step forward. His movements were deliberate, his posture confident as he positioned himself at the edge of the platform, staring down at the puppet with a cold, calculating look in his eyes. He was the one who could win, Gi-hun knew that. He always had the upper hand. But something had changed in Sang-woo. His eyes were distant, empty. "Move your head to the left," Sang-woo commanded, his voice steady. The puppet's head twitched, jerking to the left in a slow, stiff movement. It wasn't graceful or natural, but it followed the command. The room went still for a heartbeat, as if everyone was holding their breath. "Move it again," Sang-woo ordered. "Now to the right." The puppet's head shifted again, this time with even more difficulty, its movement jerky and unnatural. There was a momentary pause, the air thick with tension. The puppet master raised an eyebrow, his gaze flicking between Sang-woo and the puppet. Then he nodded, a signal to the guards. A moment of dread passed before the verdict was given. Success. Player 218 will proceed. A small victory, but Sang-woo's cold expression didn't change. He simply turned and walked back to his spot without a word. His eyes never left the puppet, and Gi-hun couldn't help but feel that, behind the stoic mask, something in Sang-woo had shifted permanently. It was Gi-hun's turn next. He felt his legs move beneath him, almost of their own accord, as if he were being propelled forward by some unseen force. Every muscle in his body screamed for him to stop, to turn back, but he couldn't. The guards were watching, their cold eyes fixed on him. And the game had already begun. He stepped up to the platform, his hands slick with sweat, his pulse pounding in his ears. The puppet stared back at him, lifeless and unmoving. It was just a mannequin, a twisted mockery of a human form, but in this place, it was the most dangerous thing he'd ever encountered. It had the power to decide his fate. Gi-hun swallowed hard and took a deep breath. "Move your left arm," he said, his voice quieter than he intended. His throat felt tight. The puppet's arm twitched, but then remained still. Gi-hun's heart dropped. His mind raced, but he couldn't figure out what went wrong. The puppet was frozen. The clock was ticking. He had to act. "Move your arm now," he shouted, his voice louder than before. The puppet's arm jerked upward, awkward and unnaturally fast. It moved, but in a way that felt wrong. Too quick, too stiff. A robotic motion that wasn't quite right. Gi-hun's pulse hammered in his ears. This was his moment. He had to get it right. The puppet's arm slowly fell back down, and Gi-hun braced himself for the inevitable. The puppet master's voice broke the silence. "Failure. Player 456 has been eliminated." Gi-hun stood there, paralyzed, his heart sinking. It was over. Chapter 10. The Last Game. The cold steel walls of the arena pressed in on Gi-hun, the silent hum of the lights above reverberating in his bones. The air was thick, almost suffocating, with the tension that hung between the survivors. The games had whittled them down to this moment. The final round. He could hardly believe it had come to this. A few days ago, he was just a man desperate to pay off his debts, a broken father struggling to make sense of his life. But now, after everything, the brutal violence, the manipulations, the deceit, Gi-hun found himself standing in a room with the remnants of humanity, all of them broken in their own ways. Every one of them was a survivor. And yet, not all of them would make it out alive. He could feel the weight of it. The last game. He didn't know what it would be, but it didn't matter anymore. He had to survive. He couldn't think about the people he had lost along the way, the faces that haunted him. Esebayak, Ali, the others who had fallen. They were all part of the past now, and there was no room for that kind of thinking anymore. There was only the future, a future that was more uncertain than ever. The loudspeaker crackled, its voice once again harsh and mechanical. "Players, your final game is about to begin. Please make your way to the arena. No weapons, no allies. Just you and the last remaining contestants." Gi-hun looked up. A sharp pang of dread lanced through him. He wasn't sure who was left. He didn't know if anyone else had survived. His eyes flicked to Sang-woo, who stood a few paces away, a grim expression on his face. The same man who had once been his friend now seemed like a stranger, a predator with the cold, calculating mind of someone who would do whatever it took to win. Gi-hun swallowed hard. There was no escaping it now. As they were herded into the main arena, the vastness of the space unfolded before them, its sheer scale overwhelming. The floor was smooth and pristine, the walls towering like some twisted monument to the power that controlled them all. The room was empty, save for the center, where a strange platform sat, lit from above by a single spotlight. Gi-hun could feel his heart pounding in his chest. The silence stretched on, a taut string about to snap. And then, the puppet master stepped into the spotlight. His mask was still the same, a faceless, blank slate that conveyed nothing. "Welcome, players," the puppet master said, his voice a controlled whisper that echoed off the walls. "This is your final test. You will face each other in one last challenge. There are no rules here. You either win or you die." Gi-hun's mind raced, his breath shallow. He wanted to speak, to ask what kind of game this would be, but his throat was dry, his mouth parched. The puppet master's words cut through the air like a knife. "You are the last 5 players standing. You have survived the trials that the others could not. And now, You will face each other in a battle to the death." Gi-hun's stomach lurched. It was no longer a game. It was a fight for survival. "Begin," the puppet master's voice rang out, and the ground beneath their feet began to shift. The platform they had been standing on split in half, opening up like the maw of some great beast. Beneath them was nothing but darkness. For a brief moment, Gi-hun felt a wave of vertigo, as if the world were falling away. The remaining players, their faces a mixture of disbelief and fear, were quickly separated by the widening gap. A loud, mechanical whirring filled the air, and Gi-hun looked up to see metal bars descending from above, each one connecting to the edges of the platform. The space around them was quickly being transformed into a labyrinth of barriers, high metallic walls that rose and fell like the teeth of some giant machine. The guards, those ever-present faceless figures, moved silently through the arena, taking their positions at strategic points, watching, waiting. The players were now alone in the arena, with only one another to trust. But trust was a luxury no one could afford here. Gi-hun's breath came in short gasps as he instinctively crouched behind one of the barriers. He looked across the arena at the others. Sang-woo, of course, was already sizing up his surroundings, scanning the field for anything that could give him an advantage. The others were already taking cover, but there was no telling what came next. Would the environment change? Would the game throw another obstacle at them? His mind raced, trying to remember everything he had learned since entering this nightmare. How to move, how to think, how to react. In this game, nothing was what it seemed. Sang-woo made the first move, darting from his position behind a high wall, using the cover to approach one of the other players. The player didn't see him coming, but before Gi-hun could even react, the sound of a struggle echoed through the arena. There were no weapons, no visible tools, but that didn't stop Sang-woo. He fought with the precision of someone who had no hesitation. The other player fell with a gasp, blood staining the pristine floor. Gi-hun's stomach churned, but he forced himself to look away. There was no time for pity, no time for weakness. Sang-woo wiped his hands on his pants, his face cold. He turned and locked eyes with Gi-hun, a smirk forming on his lips. It wasn't a friendly expression. It was a challenge. "Don't think for a second you're getting out of here alive, Gi-hun," Sang-woo called out, his voice low and dangerous. Gi-hun's heart raced, but he didn't back down. He couldn't. He wouldn't. The others remained hidden, too cautious to make a move. But Gi-hun knew this was it. The final game. A game where only one would survive. His hand brushed the edge of a piece of debris, sharp and jagged. He didn't hesitate. He picked it up, using the sharp metal shard as a makeshift weapon. His fingers tightened around the cool, cold metal. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. The guards were watching them, silent and still. There was no escape. There were no more chances. Gi-hun wasn't sure who would strike first, but he knew one thing for certain. If he didn't act now, it would be his last chance to do anything at all. He ran. The noise of his footsteps was deafening in the arena, each step echoing against the walls. The others quickly became aware of his movement. He could hear their frantic steps, but his eyes were locked on Sang-woo. The final confrontation was inevitable. He had no illusions anymore. He had to win this, or everything he had fought for, everything he had survived for, would be lost. He lunged. Sang-woo's eyes widened for a moment, but he quickly recovered, parrying Gi-hun's strike with a swift move that sent him sprawling backward. They circled each other, each move calculated, precise. The game had come down to this final battle between the two of them. Gi-hun could feel the desperation in his limbs. His heart pounded in his chest. He was fighting not just for survival, but for everything he had lost. For his family, for his future. But Sang-woo was a dangerous opponent, and every move he made was designed to ensure his own survival at any cost. The struggle continued, a brutal dance of survival. And then, in a moment of sheer instinct, Gi-hun saw his opening. He lunged forward, using the shard of metal to strike. The moment was swift, almost too quick to process. Sang-woo gasped, the weapon plunging deep. He collapsed to the floor, the arena falling eerily quiet as the lights above them flickered. Gi-hun stood over him, his breath ragged, his face a mixture of exhaustion and something deeper. Something he couldn't name. The puppet master's voice broke the silence. The winner of the final game is player 456, Gi-hun. Gi-hun couldn't feel the triumph. He couldn't feel anything. He just stood there, surrounded by death, unable to process the enormity of what had just happened. The arena, the games, everything had come to an end. But in the end, Gi-hun had won. And in this place, that was all that mattered. And so, the tale we've shared together comes to its final chapter. A journey filled with twists and turns, filled with emotions both light and dark. As the story unfolded before your eyes, you walked alongside the characters, felt their triumphs, their heartbreaks, and their struggles. But just as every great story has its ending, so too does our time together. And before we part ways, I want to take a moment to say thank you. Thank you for being part of this journey, for letting the story become a part of your own. Your support means the world. If you enjoyed the adventure we've gone on, I invite you to share it with others. Let the story spread so we can keep exploring more worlds, more tales together. Don't forget to like if you feel the story touched you, to share if you believe the tale deserves to be heard, and of course to subscribe because the next chapter, the next adventure, is just waiting for us around the corner. So, until next time, thank you once again for listening. Stay curious, stay adventurous, and keep the stories alive. See you soon, friend.